Say, were you in the mood for a treat? Because guess what? You're getting a treat. Well, that is if you keep watching. I sit down with the mojo storyteller, Joe Lansdale. And yes, I was a bit starstruck to talk to the guy. You know, I have a couple of shelves full of his books. And you will pick up on this perhaps if you watch closely, but I do just kind of stumble into questions. But Joe Lansdale is someone that you ask a question and you just step to the side for several minutes and he will go off and he will fill the hour and he fills the hour. I think this is one of the rare cases where I had like an hour and 17 minutes of interview and I trimmed it down to an hour and 13 minutes. 4 minutes of fat? That's rare and weird. Usually I chop off 20, 30 minutes of stuff. But I think when he gets going, it's you got to capture it all. You just gotta open up that bucket, just capture it, and say, this is a damn fine bucket of content. And again, step to the side, please. Nobody's here to hear from me. Also, let me apologize to any of the long-term fans who have read all the Joe Lansdale catalog, and you may be jealous. Like, why did you get to interview the guy? I would have asked better questions. I would have asked Happen Leonard specific questions, all that stuff. So let's just get it out of the way. Yes, I'm an idiot, but I'm the idiot that got to interview Joe Lansdale. In this interview, he reveals something about himself that he's never revealed anywhere else. So that's clickbait. But you're already here, so you clicked on it. So I don't know how to clickbait. You should also know the audio near the end gets mangled for a brief little moment. But again, even mangled audio from Joe Lansdale is gold. So it stayed in. And you'll see why when you get to it. And just bear with it. It goes away. But it's annoying. Not as annoying as my voice. Some of this turns into a Philip Jose Farmer commercial, which makes me want to read the 5 Philip Jose Farmer books I have that I've never read. Another thing you should know about Joe Lansdale is that when it comes to writing, he never craps in a sack and throws the sack over the fence. So you can put those concerns to rest. Well, most of all, just imagine how awesome it would be to interview Joe Lansdale. Think about that vibe. Keep watching and watch something even better than that.
For once, I'm not talking to myself. It's time to go beyond the book and get over your shelf. Wow. So yes, this is quite an amazing honor to be talking to you. You are on my list, my short list of must-read authors.
Thank you.
And I started reading you a lot later in your career than I would have liked. I didn't realize you'd been out there genre hopping and writing horror and writing some really crazy stuff that I would have been enjoying all these years. But I don't know why it took so long. So that's my fault. I'm not blaming you.
A lot of people don't know I've been around since the 70s. I've been selling stuff since the 70s. Yeah.
It's kind of crazy. And you're I actually had some of your work in Jonah Hex before any of that, and you were in comic books.
Yeah, I was in comic books. I actually started out with nonfiction. I wrote nonfiction articles about farming, and then I moved to Mike Shane Mystery Magazine, and then later I did some anthologies and Twilight Zone magazine, and took off from there. And though I'm kind of known for horror, I've written less horror than anything else.
Well, that's one thing I had on deck to talk to you about, because I was always a Stephen King fan. I was a Stephen King fan from a young age, and they call him horror, and I always hated that. I thought, he's a storyteller first, and some horrific things happen, some exciting things, some crime things, all these things happen. But the moment you say horror, it becomes a box.
Yep.
How do you feel about that label when they say, "Oh,
well, I don't mind. I don't mind somebody looking at a specific story and saying this is a horror story or a crime story or a Western or literary magazine story or whatever the hell they want to call it. I'm okay with that. What I'm not as fond of, though it doesn't, it doesn't worry me at night or anything, is being called a horror writer or a crime writer or whatever exclusively. I'm a writer, and I write all kinds of things, and I try to, as time has gone on, I've tried to write Lansdale stories. So I'm the Lansdale genre.
Excellent. I love that. I love that. It's so true, because I've read a number of your books, a lot. I haven't read any of the Hap and Leonard series. I have like all of them. I just actually got this one, The Elephant of Surprise. So I'm a little bit behind, and I have all your SST books and all that. And it is a Lansdale story. There is like, if it's the drive-in, which is crazy. Where would you define that? Is that horror?
It's got horror in it. They marketed it originally as science fiction, and the label said science fiction on the spine of the Bantam book, I think. But it's been called horror. It was nominated for horror awards. It's been called satire. It's just been called weird. and I think that was the moment in time, maybe the novel before that, The Magic Wagon, when I really found me, when my voice began to prevail. And the drive-in, I hated it while I was writing it. I thought it was awful. I said, man, I'm missing the boat with this piece of shit. But I just kept writing, and I turned it in, and then I thought, oh my God. And they wrote back, well, we love this. Or my buddy, Pat Labruto, he's my buddy now. Back then he was just my editor. And we became good friends over time, but he really liked it. And I said, So when I read the galleys, which we called galleys back then, I said, you know what? This is a lot better than I thought it was, because I was actually trying to make the book a character instead of just having the characters in it. The characters in it are broad purposely, and the book itself is the character, which is something that I think that Kurt Vonnegut did very well. He didn't have, I think my characterization was a little more detailed than his, but he meant for his not to be. He meant to do it that certain way. And there are a handful of writers who I think their books themselves are the characters. The tonality of the books, the way the books feel when you get through, that's the character. That's what you remember. And when you try to dice it and say, well, what about this point of that? It doesn't work, because it becomes a sort of mind meld. It's all of this stuff going on all at once, and blending in a way that made me feel that it was the only way I could write it, and I think a lot of my writing actually developed out of absolute ignorance about how things were done.
So when you start a book, what's the first thing that forms? Like, what do you see first?
Number 1, chapter 1. That's true. I usually, my problem isn't a lack of ideas, it's too many ideas. And it's also, sometimes I can have ideas that I know would make a great book. And I had to learn over time that doesn't mean it's an idea for me. I've passed on some of my ideas, and other people were able to use them. And I've even had ideas. I said, this is a major bestseller right here. This idea is, but I can't write it because it bores me when I get into it. And it's not because the idea unto itself is boring. It's because of my nature and the way I think about writing when I'm actually writing, that even if I try to say I'm going to gear this, I always turn out to be me. And that's why I quit doing that long ago. And I just write like everybody I know is dead. I write for me.
That's awesome. Yeah. I think that comes through. There's some things. So like I said, I was always a Stephen King fan, and I always hated the label. They'd put him in a box. He's a horror writer. And I'm like, no, he's a storyteller. He is a master storyteller. And that's one thing about what you do, that same vibe. It really feels like you're sitting there and you're getting a confidential insight into these people's lives. Like they feel real, they feel relatable. And there's that art of, I just read this book, and I'm not going to talk about who it was, but he's doing a lot of telling, but he's not doing any showing. And yeah. I think that's the key to feel like you're like, right.
Yeah. Well, no, I think that is always the key, but I think there are some of us who are storytellers more than we're conventional writers. That doesn't mean that we don't have, I like to think I'm a stylist. I really believe my style is powerful and that it's interesting and it's unique to me. And it came really just by accident over time. You know, you write enough, you chip away at things until you finally get to your core. And my dialogue is me and things like that. So it's not just pure storytelling, because for me, there are a lot of people who maybe have a good story to tell, but I can't get to it because I'm not interested in the way they express those images. You know, sometimes they're overly self-conscious. Sometimes they just don't have the knack to describe something where I can believe it, you know, and, you know, I'm not saying I always do either. It's just like anything else, you know, there's hit and miss, and there's constant work at trying to do the best you can. And I never, you know, just, you know, crap in a sack and throw it over the fence and say, good luck. I mean, I always try very hard to do a really good piece of work. And sometimes I succeed better than others. And, you know, long ago, I think it was Harlan Ellis and I were talking about it one time. You know, we talked about the fact that a writer should at least be attempting to do the equivalent of building a cathedral. But if they can't do that, they at least need to be able to construct a very functional chair, you know. So that's true. You know, some stories are kind of like a really functional chair, which is fine. You know, it's like a bologna sandwich and some chips, or a drink if you want to go another direction. But sometimes it's a cathedral, or if to continue with the meal, it's like a 7-course meal with, you know, great food and a wonderful dessert and a good cup of coffee. You know, you never know all the time what you're going to manage. Some of the books that I had the highest hopes for, I didn't quite get where I meant to be. And some of those that I thought, well, I've got a contract and I'm going to write this as best I can, but man, I got 4 months to do it. It turned out to be some of my best books. The Drive-In was written in 2.5 months to a deadline, because I also sold Cold in July at the same time. And so I had to finish, and I had to get on Cold in July right after. And it took 2.5 months, but it was a delight to write, where the Drive-In was not. And the second Drive-In novel was no fun either. Only one I had fun was the third one.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Did you have the ending in mind when you started out writing it? Because that
no, I had no idea where that thing was going. I'm pretty much that way with everything. I had no idea where, you know, anything was going. I think my early novels like Act of Love, and The Night Runners and Dead in the West, I had more of an idea, but that's because I was still trying to do that thing where you sit down and construct, what do you do and all that. But that doesn't work for me. I'm much better by just learning. I learned over time to let my subconscious do the work, which relieved me of stress, and it relieved me of just thinking about story all the time. I wanted to be able to at least go to the bathroom without feeling like I had to jump up and go try to come up with an idea or something. And gradually, I began to trust my subconscious. And it doesn't mean that I don't occasionally have something, you know, in the conscious mind, or I see something, I go, oh, I'm going to borrow that. I like that. I saw that happen. I'm going to do that. But I depend on my subconscious. I depend on my past. I depend on my experiences, or the experiences of others who have told me different things. I depend on you know, just incredible amounts of books I've read and still read. But I also, at the same time, try to not have the stink of the library on everything I write. I want it to feel like it's happening, not just that it's, you know, library information, or that it's, you know, borrow this piece from here, borrow that piece from there. And sometimes you're influenced by other people, whether you mean to or not. So I'm not trying to paint myself as self-righteously clean. I'm trying to paint myself as self-righteously trying, you know. And I think sometimes I really make it. But there are so many writers too that have influenced me from a child on, that their imagery and stuff is still there, and sometimes it slips through, and hopefully in my own view, you know, and somehow that it's been polished through my glass, through my prism, you know. And it's the best I can do. And I really believe that if you look at most of my work, it feels fresh. It feels like it's me.
it certainly does. Going back to something you said about how you let your subconscious do it, and you're going with it. And I remember I think it was Stephen King, not to mention him again, but I think he did say, he goes, when you write a story, you don't go out looking for the characters. You go out to the middle of a field, you build a fire, and you wait, and they start coming in to the fire.
That's pretty much it.
And
that's pretty much it.
But how do you do that with a detective story? Don't you have to know, like, are you just discovering along the way with like Hap and Leonard, or,
Yeah,
really?
yeah. My dog doesn't like that method. But yeah, I am doing that. I am doing that. I'm discovering it as I go. But I've been doing it so long now that I'm no longer worried. The idea about building the fire and hoping everybody shows up, or expecting everybody to show up, that's the way I work. I've had, rare moments when for some reason, you're out there with the fire and you're watching it burn pretty low. That doesn't happen much with me. And I always panic about halfway through any book I'm writing. I always go, oh, hell, what's happening here? And I do essentially one draft of everything. And then I get a polish. So I guess you could call that 2 drafts, but I draft so tight and correct as I go, so that when I get to the polish, it's very little to be done. I'd say that 98% of the book, 98% of the book is written right. And then the other percentage is that tightening things up, or realizing that since I do come by stories by subconscious, that I might be able to strengthen what happens here by putting in, this dog over here or whatever it is, so that it fits. But I just don't have that trouble much. And one thing, again, is extensive reading helps, but also my father was a storyteller, and my grandmother was a pretty good storyteller, and some of my other relatives were. And when I was little, we used to put chairs out in the yard and everybody would start talking, and I would sit and listen because I was just fascinated. My dad was born in 1909. I think my mother was 1914 or 15. And when he was born in 1909, Mark Twain was still alive.
Wow.
He died the next year. And Wyatt Earp died in 1921, I think it was. And Buffalo Bill was alive. He died in 1917. Yeah. Annie Oakley was alive. She died later. I'm not sure exactly when. Bat Masterson was alive. Cars were around, but they were still a novelty. My dad, they rode horses and had wagons and, all that sort of stuff. My grandmother came to Texas in the 1880s in a covered wagon.
Wow.
And she died in nearly 100 years old. So she went from coming to Texas in a covered wagon. She saw Buffalo Bill's Wild West show.
Wow.
Her people did the Oklahoma land rush, her folks, and so then she saw people land on the moon. So these were people I grew up with that told stories, because my dad was 42 when I was born. I have a brother that's almost 17 years older than me, just short of that.
Wow.
And so it was unique, because in some ways I was raised like my grandparents, and my father was a very strong physical man that could not read or write. My mother had 11th grade education. She was a big reader, and she encouraged that. My dad was always supportive of it, because he knew how hard it was not to be able to read and write. And when he got in his 50s, he got to where he could kind of dope out the newspaper, because my mother and I would help him with certain things, but he was never literate, never truly literate. And so he had this great way of storytelling, but he never really talked that much until he got in the mood. I would always hope we would find that mood. And he had this beautiful baritone voice. And when he would start telling those stories, the voice itself was mesmerizing. And he used a lot of metaphors and similes, because back then, when people didn't know big words, they had to have examples. And I borrowed that. I still do that. And coming from East Texas, people have that tendency anyway. So I borrow a lot of that in my writing. And in some ways, it may be even a little excessive, but I decided I didn't care, because it was what made those stories East Texas to me, And so I've stayed in that tune, some more than others, depending on the narrator and the tone of the story.
Well, that is it. Now, right. Everything you said right there just makes absolute, total, crystal clear sense to me now, because you're approaching writing in the best possible way. You're approaching it as a story. You're approaching it as a human connection, a human experience. Sharing the human experience with someone else is essentially storytelling. You're not approaching it as an academic. There's one writer I talked to who he comes up with the plot device. He comes up with with the deceit. I don't want to say that because I don't want to minimize. I love
Well,
all
I know what
stories.
you mean, though. I know what he means. I know what he's talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So he comes up with this thing, and then he puts characters that make that thing make sense. So the characters
I
are,
got you.
and for me, that academic approach, that sort of it takes some heart out. It's still enjoyable stories, still much success to this guy.
I hear you. I feel much the same way. I don't even know that I come up with the characters per se. I come up with the voice. And once that voice comes out, that character will arrive. And I do a lot of first person stuff. Not all my stuff's in first person, but a
Yeah.
largest percentage of long work. Some of the shorter work's more in third person and first person mixed. But the novels are nearly all first person. I've even started novels and we get 50 pages into them. And I say, man, this is just, this is dead as, last year's Christmas. And I'll just start messing with it and say, okay, let's try it in first person. 9 times out of 10, that's my problem. It's not
Wow.
always, but I think it's because first person is closer to the true storyteller voice. When people
Yes.
sat around campfires, once those people arrived at Mr. King's campfire, they generally didn't tell stories in the third person.
No.
They told them in the first person, even as I heard it or I had it happen to me, one of the two. And so to me, that's what works best for me, are what I call the close third person, where it's third person, but it almost seems like first person because you stay in that person's viewpoint pretty much,
Yeah.
And oddly enough, if people read enough of my work, they also know that I've been influenced by a lot of experimental writers. So if you read a lot of my short stories in particular, you're going to see that. You're going to see that people who did experimental work influenced me for a number of those, because I think that kind of thing works better in shorter fiction. I don't tend to like the tense where you go, I am driving. I drove is more to me, it's always kind of past tense. There are exceptions.
Yeah.
My friend Kathleen Kent writes in that tense, and she's just riveting. So it's not that it can't be done or anything can't be done, but in general, I don't like it. It pulls me out of the story immediately because, people don't, talk like that when they're telling you a story. And I guess what they're trying to do is they're trying to accomplish the aspect of this is happening this minute. But I like to think that it's being told after the fact. And I don't always think that it's being told to someone. I think it's a running monologue through that person's head. And when I read Raymond Chandler's, books, when he talks about Philip Marlowe, I don't know that Philip Marlowe is telling anybody that, but I think that he reflects, or it happened, or as he thinks about it. And another thing about that is I discovered recently, something I didn't know, is not everybody has a running monologue in their head. I do. I'm constantly, and I talk to myself. I wander around in the yard and just talk to myself. And some people don't have that. And some people have some slighter version of it, because I talked to a couple of my friends who are writers and they don't have that at all. They go, no, that I don't really have that much of an imagination. I have to look for. And that's the other thing. I have an intense imagination, probably growing up in some place rural. And when I was young, my parents were just great. Everybody had their flaws, me, them, whatever, but they were great parents. And I would have to make up my own entertainment, and my imagination became so intense and my mother would get worried. But I could always tell the difference between real and imagined. To this very day, on some mornings, it's not daily, on some mornings or some evenings, as the sun rises or the sun goes down, and it's just starting to kind of melt through the trees like butter, I will see things crawling through the trees. And I've always done that. And they seem as real as you can imagine, yet I know in my mind, it's not real. It's not real, that it's just my mind giving me some kind of entertainment. And I know too that when I'm driving, and I don't drive long distances quite as much as I used to, but I used to drive to different conventions or events and things like that. And as I drove, if I got tired, if I was doing a lot of driving on the right, first of all, I would see something run out in front of me, and it was usually like I thought it was a dog. I didn't want to run over it. And then I would see somebody run out in front of me, and that's your mind trying to say, hey, you're getting tired. And then I had this more, and this happens less than the others, but it happens when I'm really, really tired, is faceless men on the right-hand side start walking toward me down, and I see them, and as I pass them, they're gone. But I see them walking in rows. It's not one, It's just one line after another. One comes, he's gone. That one keeps coming, but they're faceless and they're men. And I don't, I wouldn't say that they look like I'm imagining. They're real to me in the sense of visualization, but in the sense of, intellectualism, I know they're not real. But it's probably some neurological thing attached to my having Tourette's, but I don't know that that's true. I have a mild form of it. Yeah.
Really? How does that express itself? The Tourette?
It doesn't very much. You'd have to know me pretty well to know I have it, but it kind of, I'll get it like that, just like that,
Huh.
a little jerk and a little bark. And
Really?
that's generally pretty much it. And maybe hypoglycemia, which I also have, but I'm careful to take care of, contributes. And it may be a separate neurological thing altogether. And it could just be that I see these things because some place in me wants to. But I believe that when I'm tired and I see the men, I know it's time to pull over, because I've nearly had an accident twice when I did not heed the walking men, the faceless men.
Wow.
And so from then on, when I see that, I thought, well, time for coffee or time to go to get a motel or what have you. Yeah. That's a little weird piece that people don't know about me. And I don't know if I've ever talked about it in public before, which I have no problem doing. It just never really thought much about it because it's so common to me. It doesn't seem like, I thought everybody did those things.
Well, I think with someone who is so in touch with his imagination and his consciousness and his subconsciousness, there's going to be things that bleed through. I think there will be, you're wearing a hole in those divisions that some people got really solid walls. You dip in and out.
Yeah. Well, I purposely drilled that hole.
Yeah.
And when I go to bed at night, my mind fills up with the next day's work. And then when I get up in the morning, it's by the time I got my shoes on, I've got it. I'm ready to go. I have my coffee. I take the dog out, have coffee, usually have something very light, which I have here at the desk,
Mm-hmm.
And then I write 3 hours. I don't rarely write any more than that because I get diminishing returns.
Yeah.
But I try to start, I'll read email and a few things like that, but I don't do much of it. I try to kick my awake gene into place a little bit, but I try not to lose the dreamscape.
Yeah.
Because I try to write closer to dreaming than not. And then, and then at the end of my day, I get 3 to 5 pages a day. Some days I'll get a whole lot more than that. I don't plan, but I have to get 3 to 5. That's my thing. And I find it fun. It's rare that it's like the drive-in was like pulling teeth,
That's
it was
crazy.
like pulling teeth out of your asshole, boom. And I think that when I do it right, it's not that way. And most of the time it's not that way. Once in a while, like Moon Lake was real hard for me to do, but it was there. Every morning when I get up, it was there.
I was going to ask you, what should I read? I didn't read either of these yet. What should I read first?
Both have their dedicated fans.
They do.
If you want to read something that's more funny, the Donut Legion. If you want to read something that's darker and has almost a fantastical edge, then it's Moon Lake. Well, this almost has a fantastical edge, but they're very different books. I mean, extremely different books.
I had this on my deck. I'm like, I'm reading that next. And this came, and then I saw some people compare the two, saying it went back and forth. So I was just wondering what you would think. But I like that.
Now people have their own choices and stuff. Both of them have done well. Both of them overall have been well received. And I'm not really sure I'm a good judge. I had such a hard time writing Moon Lake. I don't have the connection to it yet, but in another year or so, I'll start being able to go, okay, I know it's a good book. I know I did good, but boy, it was tough. And I made one major mistake in it. Then I thought, you know what, I'll live with it.
Well, now I think that's one I'm going to read at the top. And getting back to something you said, which I thought was really interesting, because I definitely think the imagination's a muscle, and it's something you got to feed, you got to exercise. Is. And yours came from a result of I don't want to say necessity, but it sounds like your brain stepped in to entertain you. And I worry. Yeah. Maybe I sound like a curmudgeon, but I worry that with everybody capturing reality and posting it immediately, they're not exercising that sort of what could be, they're just capturing.
Yeah, it's why so much one reason you have so many sequels and people trying to write something like somebody wrote, which is that's not all bad too. Sometimes playing with nostalgia is great fun. I've done it and
Right.
enjoyed doing it. I finished one of the unfinished Tarzan novels that Edgar Rice Burroughs had started, and I loved doing it. It was great fun. But it's not my best work, but it wasn't Edgar's best work either, come to think of it. But I don't think a lot of people are developing their imaginations, and they have a harder time reading because they're used to flashing lights all the time and something going on and just their concentration. They all say, well, I've got ADD or whatever it is, and many people do, but a lot of it is just the fact that they never got the opportunity to truly train their imagination to
Yeah.
invent. And that's what I try to do, is I try to invent. And I have a short attention span myself, but when I read, I can get involved. I also have very fortunate ability to read fast without skipping a word, and I retain what I read pretty well. I'm not photographic memory or anything like that, but I used to be able to read. Sometimes I could quote or nearly quote something out of a book I'd read like a year or two ago. I still do a little of that, but as I've gotten older, it's a little less of a skill, an ability rather, I guess, than a skill. But I was born being able to read fast. It's just something about my hand to eye or whatever it is, just a fortunate twist of fate, you know, and that's been a real aid to me because, I used to read a book in a day easy when I was working full time and writing, because a lot of the books too that I read, they were short. When I was reading science fiction and fantasy and crime, they were anywhere from 120 to 180 pages. There would be
Yeah.
exceptions to be 200 or more, but there weren't that many 300. That came later. And I read literary novels in between that were somewhat longer. I think I've read nearly all of Hemingway and Fitzgerald and some of Faulkner, all of Flannery O'Connor, who I adore, Carson McCullers, all of these, and I could go on with the list. I mean, you don't want to hear my whole list, but I read all of these writers, and I read a lot of hard-boiled writers who I think were literary writers. Even James Cain, he actually was never published in pulps and stuff. He wrote entirely for slicks from the beginning of his career on. And he was a big influence. And so many writers are. Philip Jose Farmer was the one that turned my imagination upside down, and he's my favorite science fiction writer. And he was real hit or miss because he had so many ideas that sometimes they overwhelmed him and sort of wrestled him into a corner, or as we say, wrestled him into a corner. And there wasn't much he could do because he had to have it finished to pay the bills. But Farmer at his best, which was frequently, was an amazing writer with an imagination beyond any that I can imagine. Ray Bradbury is sitting on his hands when it comes to Farmer and his imagination. But
Wow.
Ray Bradbury was more consistent. I think Bradbury's last 30 years and so were all okay and good, but his best stuff was early on, before someone told him that he was the greatest literary writer around. And I think he might have believed it for a while. And it's okay to get those things. I always post good stuff, but I never really say this has got to be true. It's somebody's opinion. It's not
Right.
like 500 people, oh, he's the best writer in the world, or 5,000 people, or 5 million. Some guy thinks you're the best writer in the world because the last thing he read was the stuff on the back of a cereal box. You don't know.
You don't.
So no, you don't know. And you've got to take it with joy, but you got to take it with respect to the fact that it may or may not be true, and probably isn't.
Yeah, that's what I tell a lot of people who, especially if you're an author or you're somehow putting your business out there and you're getting reviews.
Yeah.
You gotta ignore. Well, you don't ignore it, but you can't let the negative reviews affect you, but also the praise, because it's the same thing. It's the other side of the coin.
Praise is good. Reviews are tools. When I get them, I put them out there. I want everyone to see that because it may draw people to the book. And of course, I have confidence in the book, or I wouldn't have written it. And but sometimes the bad reviews are smarter than the good reviews. And I've often read them. I go, yeah, that's exactly what I did. That's exactly what I missed. But it's a matter of, did that mean that the book was good or bad? It means that this bothered that person enough that it was bad to them.
Right.
And in other cases, I've learned that book's done. You can't learn anything about that book. but you might take some of that, put it in the back of your mind and say, well, maybe that's something I can learn. But I never really put it in the forefront. I never really think about it after the reading. In fact, if I get a good review, I will read it over and over and over till it just becomes words on paper, you know, because I don't want to get caught up in that. But that doesn't mean I don't think they're clever tools. They are. And it doesn't mean that I don't think those people wrote them with sincerity. I think 99% of them did. There's 1% that'll give you great reviews and they tell they haven't read the book.
Right.
And there's people who give you bad reviews and you can tell they haven't read the book or didn't understand the book, you know.
So let's talk about this book, Psycho. So you wrote the intro. Why do you know why you were picked to do the introduction to the Suntup edition?
Well, I did know Bob a little. We weren't like best friends or anything like that, but I knew him a little. But also, I think highly of that book and the film, and I think that it's a turning point in suspense novels and films. That this was it. Bob was onto it, but he also what his real meter was short stories. He wrote some of the best short stories ever written, as far as like crime and mystery and horror and all of that goes on. And he had a good style that he developed outside of his teenage years when he was a Lovecraft imitator. But as time went on and he started selling away from Weird Tales and to Playboy and different places like that, he helped invent what we think of as modern suspense. And people forget that a lot of that stuff that's you know, old hat now didn't exist before Bob wrote that book. And not just a book, a lot of short stories. And I think that when I was growing up, he was my biggest influence for short stories. But Edgar Rice Burroughs was the most important writer I ever read, because before that, I'd read comics. That made me want to write and made me want to draw. I was like a genius artist until I realized at 12, I was still the same as I was at 4. So I was not nearly the genius, you know, but you felt that way. Oh, I'm great. And then you go, oh, that's ugly. That doesn't look good. But the stories got better. My stories got better. And then I discovered through Classics Illustrated all the novels and short stories that had been, you know, scripted or adapted. And I went to, you know, when I got the chance to go to the library, we didn't have one in the town. We had a bookmobile. And then I moved later to a place where they had, you know, a library. I would go and look those books up and read them. But when I read Edgar Rice Burroughs, I no longer wanted to be a writer. I had to be one. And so I give him that credit. And I still love him to this day, even though he's dated and a lot of things don't work as well. But there's a magic that Burroughs had that I've tried to continue to capture. He had a forward momentum and an inventiveness. And he was willing to go out on the limb, like Phil Farmer used to say, sometimes you got to go out the limb and go out on a limb and saw it off with you sitting on the wrong end. And I believe that's true. I'm willing to fail. I'd rather have an interesting failure than a bland success. You know, anybody can get a bland success, and you've got to be kind of brave, you know, to go out and do those things, because everybody said, well, that's not like other stuff. Well, no shit, Sherlock.
Yeah.
When I was writing short stories in the early 80s, I would send them out, and, you know, I'd gotten past my conventional era, and I would send them out and people go, well, that's not the way these work, or not the way they end. So things like The Pit, By Bizarre Hands were constantly rejected. And finally, you know, when they did sell, they caught on. And when Night They Missed the Horror Show appeared in David Scow's Silver Screen anthology with a lot of other good writers, there was a turn. And now that book sometimes taught in college and all. But at the time I was first trying to sell some of those stories, nobody knew what they were. They didn't know what to make of them. They thought, they didn't think they ended right. And sometimes they were from the viewpoint of some very bad people, or they were about very bad people. Instead of seeing the nature of the story, the content, they saw things that offended them because they were easily offended. And if they had looked at it and read the whole thing, they would realize that I was offending that.
I think people need to draw the line. If you have a character who's doing very hateful things, that's the character, not the author.
Yeah, and especially when you use it to reveal stuff and talk about stuff. And I think the difference with me than a lot of other writers in that period, and there are exceptions. I'm not trying to make myself special. I'm just saying a difference in a lot of other writers is I was as influenced by literary writers as I was by popular genre writers. And so when I started writing this stuff, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it had to mean something to me. It had to be about something, even if it was under the surface. You know, when I wrote The Drive-In, that was about a lot of things, you know, a whole lot of things. And I look at it now and I think, damn, you know, we're not far off living in that universe, you know. It's like Philip K. Dick. When I would read him, I'd go, wow, I'm glad that universe doesn't exist. Well, now it does.
Oh my gosh.
We live in Philip K. Dick technology and world, you know, we really do.
Mm-hmm.
The AI, the whole thing, all that stuff, whether it was, you know, intentional or accidental, was predicted.
Yeah. I saw on your Wikipedia page about, you're not anti-religion, but you consider yourself an atheist. Well, yes, I think in this case, we're building our God. Like,
oh, you're right.
It's like we're not creating the idol to the God. We're actually now trying to build something that's going to supplant our intelligence.
Yeah, I think that's true. You know, the thing is, in some ways, we all have religions, in the sense that films and books are my religions, libraries and theaters were my religions growing up. Now I've got the library here, or I've got the TV over there. Occasionally I still go to movies when I can. So those were my cathedrals in a way. But what's happening is you build inside your head your own universe when you're a writer, and especially if you return to, like Hap and Leonard, they live in East Texas, but they live in an alternate universe, East Texas, that seems real, but yet it's bigger than life. Well, that's a creation, but still I know the difference. I know that that's a creation and that's not reality. But yeah, I mean, religion, you can almost run me a mile with religion. I started out to be a preacher. And when I was 11, I said, I'm going to read the Bible all the way through. And that cured me. As soon as I got through, I said, oh man, that's just like all the mythology I've read. It's like Greek and Roman mythology. It's like, to some extent, Norse mythology. It's like all of those mythologies where humans have come up with explanations and put hateful things in the mouth of this imaginary person or imaginary creature or imaginary deity, whatever it is, however you want to look at it. So to me, just that alone cured me. I could see the resemblance. I could see the human nature in it. And it took me a few years to really accept what I thought. But by the time I was 17, I was definitely a stone atheist, you know, and you know what? It was like a freeing moment. It was like, now I'm happy, because that stuff always made me miserable. It just made me miserable. And then the people would say, well, you don't have to take it literal. And I believe that. But the problem is, if you don't take it literal, it means, why are you wasting your time on those books for anyway? You can get stories from them. You can get fables from them, but don't preach them to me, you know? And a lot of people that don't take it literally actually take it literally, in spite of what they say.
Interesting.
And you have a lot of people in religion. You have a lot of people in religion, when you hear them talk, that are Christians by their own evaluation, very rarely speak about Jesus. They very rarely speak about the New Testament. They talk about the Old Testament, because it's the one where you can be mean, where you can have fun reading about murder and incest and all that stuff. And the other thing that people don't think about is that when you start reading the New Testament, or for that matter, any one of them, it's not what was originally written. The New Testament had the Apocrypha in it, and that's some mean stuff. Jesus killed people in the original versions, and those were removed, and they were polished out to fit the King James era, you know, how they were thinking then. And you go back, it happens. In the oldest Bible, I think it's the Mount Sinai Bible, doesn't even have a resurrection in it. And so those things were added later. And Jesus in the Apocrypha, I forget which book it is. It's not Tubit, I can't remember, but he would say, thou shalt not finish your course. And he killed a person when he said that. They would die. And he did it so often that when a kid fell off a roof and died because he hit the ground, they blamed Jesus. And Jesus brought that character back to life in that book, so he could say, no, it wasn't him. I was like, I'm fucking around and fell off the roof.
Wow. You
know, who picks what's right and what's not.
I gotta say, let's just put all that on the side and say, even if there was a book written by a deity over how to live your life, these are the rules, here you go, The moment it's handed to a human being, or the moment it leaves the initial person transcribing it and given to another human being, that's where everything goes off the rails, because it it becomes a bludgeon, it becomes a weapon. And yeah, it becomes
Yeah.
something you can.
Well, in the Old Testament, the monks that were copying it used to write, "Stop changing this," in the margins, because people would start embellishing and putting their own. Like there's one version where you can see where they kind of made up the Noah story to put in there, borrowing it from Gilgamesh, and all of those things. And once you start going back and you think, well, wait a minute, this is 2,000 years old. What happened to everybody that lived before that? God was he giving them a pass, or were they just all, toasted like crackers? And there's really no hell in the Old Testament. I don't think that appears until the New Testament.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. No, there's a lot of stuff that you would assume is in there, and they're like, well, actually, if you look it up, there's no mention of even the Antichrist isn't until Revelations, and it's not even this devil idea. It is somebody who's a force
full of great stories. And I approach it the same way I do with mythology. I borrow from it conceptually, story wise. It's like Shakespearean stuff. It's all very much connected, and these dramas, these human dramas, and these tragedies. And there's very little comedy there.
No,
but there is in Shakespeare. And so, you learn from these things, even if you believe them or don't believe them. There's a great way to think about stories, and how to look at them.
Yeah, and I think if you pull and you extrapolate and you find some good in it, as far as how to live your life, I mean, you could find the same thing in here. Because when I read this, I was sad. Well, number one, I was sad because I didn't read it in context. What a shocking book this must have been when it was first.
It was then,
yeah. And knowing so much about it and knowing how this works.
Well, the story is that Alfred Hitchcock had all the copies bought up so people wouldn't know the ending, at least in Los Angeles. So he
really
had people buy. That's the story. And I believe it's true, but I don't know it's true. But presumably, he didn't want anybody to know the ending of it. And there were changes in it. Joseph Stefano, is that the guy that wrote the screenplay, I think? But anyway, in the book, he's a heavy guy, and it's a little different, but it has that wicked sense of humor that I can see that Hitchcock latched into. But you're right, it's been duplicated. It's influenced so many writers and in so many ways, and so many people in film and comics, that people look at it now and they don't realize the impact that book had.
I think a lot of stuff before this book, there's a whole era of what goes on in your own home, you keep it there.
Mm-hmm.
You had husbands that were beating their wives, and as long as they showed up to church on Sunday with enough cover up on, everybody kept their secrets. And this book dragged it out and said, here's something that when you pull this out into the daylight, this is something that people are capable of. And this is what the human brain can do when it's broken.
The worst part is society sanctioned a lot of these things. Is that when I was growing up in the South, although it wasn't in my home, I would hear a woman have a black eye and say, what happened? Well, I had to be corrected. Every once in a while, as a woman, I have to be corrected.
Wow.
What kind of sad world is that?
Yeah.
And you would hear that from certain people. I mean, I'm not saying everybody did that, but it was surprising how many women embraced that, because it was society in which they grew up, and it was usually using religious reasons for it or social reasons, whatever. So there was a lot of that. And Black people, when I was growing up, if people don't know it's better now, it's because they didn't live then.
Yeah.
It's so much better. I mean, it was horrible. And if I could see it was horrible, just think about Black people and what they dealt with personally.
Getting to what you said about her, the woman, this figure saying I had to be corrected. I think the chilling thing isn't the bruise on her face anymore. It becomes what's in her head and in her heart to think.
The bruise in the head.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
it's more like a wound in the head that's made you accept this lot in life. I mean, I knew a number of Black people that felt that way too. They had grown up in that kind of repressive atmosphere, and they just felt like, well, okay, this is our lot in life. And some people that I knew, even black and white, accepted that the Old Testament had designed that they were going to be slaves, and that was their lot. And it comes from when Abraham's sons, I think it was Ham, or I can't remember exactly, saw him nude.
Yeah.
And so the rest of his descendants were cursed as slaves. I thought that must have been a set of weird balls to make that happen.
Yeah. What's interesting is I worked some time as a teamster on the produce market, and I worked with this old black man who came up from the South. I don't know when, I don't know how long ago. And he said something really interesting to me. He said, he goes, "I'll take a Southern racist over a Northern racist any day." And I said, what do you mean? He goes, "A Southern racist white guy will look you right in the eye and tell you what he thinks you're, whatever you are. He'll out and out say, I hate you and don't ever come near me and this and that and this." He goes, a Northern racist will look at you and smile and shake your hand and say nice things, but all the while they're thinking exactly what that Southern guy said. And now,
yeah, at least you can see the Southern guys coming. That's when I moved off to San Francisco, Berkeley, actually, for a while, thinking, this was a way to get away from that. And then I really missed my home. I missed the people, because in general, they're really good people.
Yeah.
If your car breaks down and you're from somewhere else, they'll stop and help you and do different things. But I realized that I couldn't see them coming out there. They were some of the same people.
Interesting. Yeah.
But I couldn't see them coming. But here I can see them coming. So I know who to avoid, and I know how to handle it. And so it's a different, one doesn't make it right over the other. And the Southern, I think racism has much to answer for because of slavery and the way people were mistreated and lynchings. Yep. And when I was growing up, if my mom was walking down the sidewalk and a black man was walking down the sidewalk, he would have to take off his hat and look at the ground until she passed. And then there was water fountains that said colored. And then there were washaterias that were colored. And there were bathrooms that were colored. And when we went to the theater, when I was a child, I saw a lot of black people going this back stair. They had the ticket booth, and it worked both ways. They could get the ticket here for the black people and the white people. But I asked my mom, I said, "Why are those people going there?" And she said, "Well, I don't know. I can't explain it, but it won't always be that way."
Wow.
And I was a child, and I didn't really understand it. I won't try to say it was an epiphany, but it was a moment in time that sort of set me up to start understanding. And the next thing that did it for me was Huckleberry Finn. When I read Huckleberry Finn, I went, "Oh, I get it." Yeah. Especially in that scene, I can't remember the exact words, but where Huck talks about he's supposed to turn Jim in, because that's the Christian thing to do. That's what it says. But he says, "You know what? I'll just go to hell." Because and I read that, I thought, okay, I get it.
Yeah,
I get it. And then when I read To Kill a Mockingbird, that worked too, because those in many ways are white people's entryway into understanding racism. Yeah. I had a black writer, really smart guy, say to me once, "Well, it's not written from the black point of view." And I said, "That's what makes it valuable. It makes the white person have to look at it from a white perspective and to start to see what's wrong with it." Now, there's some people can read it and get a thing at it because they're dumb. And then there are some people who, like me, and I mean, I'm talking about being young. I went, "Whoa, wait a minute." And then Martin Luther King came along, and these speeches were so eloquent. I don't know if you've ever heard his speeches, but they're beyond eloquent. I don't like religion, but boy, I like the way he preached.
Yeah. And I think that's super valuable. And I think there's always something that I always said, like, a smart person learns from their mistakes, and a wise person learns from other people's mistakes. And that also goes,
that's
and that also goes toward how you see other people treat other people. So, for example, talking about the white experience and encountering racism, I remember when I worked at that produce market again, and I'd have over the road truck drivers come in, and they'd stand next to me and they'd kill the time until I was able to unload their truck. And they would volunteer some information, and they assumed some things about me because I'm a white kid. And they would be open. I remember one guy came up to me, he goes, "How can you work with all these folks?" And we had guys, because we were right near the Chicago projects, And there were these guys that came in, they were called lumpers, and they would come in and they'd unload truck for cash. So they'd get money that the government didn't know about because they were on aid. So they were working the system, sure, but they were for what? You know, it's not like they were making millions. So they would come and they unload these trucks, and this truck driver is like, man, these guys, I bet you, you know, you do a lot better without. I'm like, some of those guys are harder working than the Teamsters they stand next to every day. And he shut up.
I used to work in the rose fields, and it was me, black people, and Mexican generally, you know, that were working there. And we were all working our asses off. But man, when nobody worked any harder than they did, because that's all they had. I knew in some place in my head that someday I wasn't going to have to do this. I had to do it then. I didn't have money. I grew up poor. You know, I grew up with a lot of ignorant background, and a lot of ignorant viewpoints, and it was all around me, because when I grew up, there weren't many people with money. And when I worked in those rose fields, I remember the first day that I was there, I worked alongside an old black gentleman and his wife, and they were working just as hard as us. And they were old. They were probably my age now, 70s. And they were working like, you know, Trojans, as they say. And as we got to the end of the row, you know, he's bent over, he's doing this, we're all bent over. He got to the end of the row and he walked off still bent. His back was like that permanently, because he had been doing field work, not necessarily just roses, but field work all his life. And to do that kind of work was pretty much hand to mouth. And a lot of times we were paid under the table, so to speak. So what Social Security did they have? You know, what did they have when they became a certain age, unless they had somebody to take care of them? And I don't know, but we became friends, and they used to make barbecue, and I would come over with my wife at that time. Well, no, it's still my wife at that time. The other wife, we did that before with the first wife. But my wife at that time worked the fields with me. We both worked it. Karen is my wife currently, and that's who it was then. And we worked those fields together. We go over for barbecue, and he always put a little sassafras in the wood, make it a little sweet. And I remember that because I'd never seen anybody do that. And you had to put just the right amount, or you would ruin the taste of the barbecue. But if you used a little sassafras, it sweetened it.
I appreciate you taking the time to share all these stories. It's fun, because as a fan, as somebody I got a whole shelf of your stuff up there. You're a hard guy to collect because you have so much out there. I'll never be a completist, but as a fan, to get the insight and to see why, now it makes sense to me. I understand why you are somebody who I have every confidence. Every time the new Lansdale book's out, I'm like, oh, this is going to be a good one.
Yeah. Well, check out those Happen Leonards. You may like them.
I have to. I got the Cold in July and Savage Season set from Zeissing, not signed or anything, but I got I read Cold in July, loved it. And that brings me to a whole other thing we didn't talk about was movie adaptations. I saw the Michael Hall movie. That was good. It was good. But for me, it's just, there's no comparison to the written word. I mean, for me.
Not for me most of the time. There are exceptions, but rarely.
And then I know The Thicket. That's
Bubba Hotep was a great adaptation.
I think I saw that once, because I didn't even know. Again, I didn't at the time. I didn't even
Amazing
know you
adaptation.
existed. But I was a Bruce Campbell fan.
Right, and there's The Thicket coming out in October. I don't have any idea if that's good or bad, because I haven't seen it. I wasn't on the set, so we'll all discover it together. Well, but and then I have Love, Death, and Robots and all the. I've been I used to write for Batman the animated series, so I've got a lot of film work in my life.
Well, The Thicket, they changed the big bad guy in The Thicket to Juliette Lewis, and that's either going to be tremendously wonderful.
That's the way I feel.
Yeah,
it's a wonderful choice or the worst. And they took out the hog.
No,
they got rid of my hog. It was in there. No hog. And they changed the way Shorty speaks. He no longer speaks in that sort of dime novel manner. So those are some big changes that I do know about because I was told about. But I beyond that, that doesn't mean it's a bad movie. I'm just saying it's a different interpretation.
Yeah,
I think that it's one of those things where you do this long enough, there's people that they're going to make it their story. And then there's others that are going to try to deliver your story as well as they can. So you just have to look at it, you know, differently and realize, and they haven't done anything to the book, because I can point to it right over there, like James Cain used to say.
Exactly. And so the thing, if I was a movie guy, I would not try to tell your story, because there's no way I'm going to tell your story better than you told your story. So I would say, what can I bring this visually that tells a version of this story? Because there's no way you can't do it. But there's no reason to take out Hog. They could put in CGI. They could make it really amazing.
There's two things that, you know, you're always going to get screwed when you hear them. A book is not a movie. Uh-oh. We're going to open this up. Uh-oh. Well, you know, some of my favorite movies, like To Kill a Mockingbird, if you read the book and you see the movie, it's the same thing. Now, they left out a lot, but it doesn't seem like they did, because the whole thing was honest and it kept the dialogue, it kept the, you know, and so I sometimes realize that they aren't changing it because it needs to, or that has anything to do with it being a film. It has to do with, they've always wanted to have a helicopter and something. And so now they're going to put, you know, or something of that nature, you know, and you meet people too, that they're scared to try and copy it. So because they think people will say, well, he just copied the book. But, you know, the best Elmore Leonard adaptations, they copied the book.
Yeah. And I think, well, you do such a great job with dialogue that carries through. So I'm disappointed to know Peter Dinklage won't be speaking as the shorty that I thought was
I don't
amazing.
know if they're using any of my dialogue or not. I don't know. That's one of the things that always shocks me, is they go, well, we'll just change the dialogue around. Really?
You can't.
You know, I mean, I understand you might not be able to use all of it, but when people, here's what I say. Yeah, I may not write the best dialogue, but I write the best Joe Lansdale dialogue. And so I write the dialogue that works for my books, you know, and my dialogue is kind of noted. So it seems like that would be something you'd want to latch on to.
Well, it goes back to what you said earlier when we were talking about what comes first, the plot, the character, and all that. And you went right to the voice. And the voice is the place where everything rests, because that's how the story is conveyed.
Yeah, well, there's some problems, I understand there's some things that seem so cinematic, like you can just stuff them in the camera, but the truth of the matter is there's so much imagery that you can't reflect it in the same way. So I understand those changes, but when you hear people say those things, we're going to open it up, you can just bend over and grease up, because you know it's fixing to what's fixing to happen. You know, it means that they have no intention of trying to understand what you did.
Yeah. And then it's a business decision. They're like, okay, this book sold X number of copies. We can kind of count on a percentage to be movie viewers as well. And therefore it's a bottom line decision. But if it's something where they're trying to bring a work to life because they love the work, then I think you're going to get that heartfelt.
It's mostly an ego decision. There are some books that can't be filmed literally, no doubt about it. But a lot of them can. And a lot of them, they don't want anybody to think they didn't come up with it. And and when you get in a writer's room and you listen to the writers, you have some really good writers and you have smart people, but they're all after a different thing. They've all got a different agenda. They're all trying to bring their feelings and what they think about things to it, which is sort of like, you know, the Tower of Babel. You have this mixture of voices and everybody's talking and nobody understands the other person. And everybody wants to be able to point and say, you see where the dog peed on that wagon wheel? That was me. I put that in. You know, everybody wants to have that. Yeah, they're looking for that ego thing, and they don't want anybody to think that they can't come up with something. And I understand that, but the best adaptations and the writers who I think understand film best are much more literal. You know, when Tarantino did Jackie Brown, that's a very literal adaptation. Does that mean there are changes? Yes. Does it mean that there are things that look different? Yes. But is that the book? Yeah.
Well, you know, it's interesting. It compounds when you consider, once you leave that writer's room and you get to a production team, and then they populate with the actors. Now, each actor is going to want to make that character at least
Yeah.
their character.
Yeah. Well, you know, you expect some of that, and some of that's what makes films good sometimes, but it's really the script where I think is my biggest problem. It's where they get away from that.
Yeah.
When you get into the other, I mean, the actors actually understand their character better than you do a lot of times because that's their job. And so they create a backstory from it. I remember on Hap and Leonard, Polly McIntosh, who is, you know, she's got a British accent. She wanted to do an American accent and she was great at it, but they didn't want her to do that. Okay. So she said, I had to totally recreate my backstory. So when she was an American, she had a backstory for it. And when she was British, she had to, and even though that's not revealed on the screen, you don't get that. It's in here in her.
Right.
And so it expressed itself. She was terrific, by the way, but she expressed herself as to the story that she had to create for herself, or that she decided this is why Angel is this way, or this is what Angel thinks. And a lot of actors do that. Maybe not all, but a lot of actors do that. There's some that just read the lines and they're terrific. You know, like Robert Mitchum, he just like, you know, he would read a script once and he knew it and he would come on and say it, you know, and he wasn't, you know, doing method acting or trying to worry about the backstory. He was trying to worry about that moment in time when he said those words.
Yeah.
And, you know, everybody has a different way, you know, of going about it.
Well, thank you again, Joe, for being here and sharing this. I can't wait to see this. And I think the audio is breaking up. I don't know if it's breaking up for you or if it's just my thing. Hopefully it's not.
Not on my end.
Okay. I really look forward to this. I read this book for the first time to get ready for this release, and it is a brilliant book. It felt more like a detective story, and I can't wait to see what you've written for the introduction. To bring getting your signature in a Suntup book is amazing. So hopefully they'll do one of yours.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah. What one would you, if I guess that's a good closing question. If Suntup said we want to do one of your books, what one book would you want Suntup to do?
Well, you know, so many of my books have already had limited editions.
Right.
But I guess if you're just going imaginary, you know, I probably Jane Goes North. And if
Really?
not that one, probably my favorite of all my works is Paradise Sky.
Really? Yeah, your fan favorite is The Bottoms.
Yeah.
Paradise Sky. I love Paradise Sky, but I put The Thicket, then Paradise Sky. Just something about.
Yeah, a lot of people do. Yeah.
Jane Goes North is what you would want, huh? Interesting. Because
Yeah,
I
had limiteds of both Paradise Sky and The Thicket, and I believe Edge of Dark Water, which is another one I'm very fond. I think Edge of Dark Water is one of my best books. The Bottoms, of course, everybody tends to like that a lot, and I do too. And Sunset and Sawdust is a book of mine that I think is overlooked. And there's All the Earth Thrown to the Sky, a young adult book I wrote. It's one of my best books, I believe. Wow. And Fender Lizards is also a book I would love to see get a special treatment.
What about Freezer Burn?
That too. There was a limited of it, but yeah, Freezer Burn is one of those. I think Freezer Burn and Jane Goes North and Fender Lizards are somewhat outliers for me, and that they've gotten attention and they sell, but they never got the attention I think they deserved. And it may be that they're just not the audience for it. Now, Fender Lizards was supposed to be a young adult novel. I wrote the first one, All the Earth Thrown to the Sky. Then I wrote that one, and they said, well, there's no vampires in it. And I thought, well, there wasn't supposed to be any vampires in it. And it's not a detective story. It's not supposed to be a detective story. And so my agent and I pulled it, and I went ahead and sold it later to Subterranean. And then now it's out from Pandy Press.
Yes, Pandy Press, your press, you're doing reissues.
My daughter and her fiance's press, really, Jonathan Levitt, you know.
Okay.
And I mean, I'm an investor, I'm a part owner, but I try to stay out of it, actually let them handle what they want to do, because they know better than I do what's going on.
Yeah, I saw the Nightworms package did Drive-In. I believe
Drive-In Anthology.
Yeah. What do you think of that? Did you read that, the Drive-In Anthology?
Yeah, it's terrific. It's absolutely terrific. I think everybody brought their A game. I feel very honored. I'm going to call out one story in particular that I'm extraordinarily fond of, and it's by David Scow. David Scow's story is great. But I mean, you got Stephen Graham Jones and I mean, the list goes on and on. All these great writers. You know, the writer that I really love and have been really hot on lately, although he doesn't do a lot, is Owen King.
Oh,
I
really?
think a lot of his, yeah, I love him. And he's got a new book coming out. I never, for some reason, let's see, it's right. Yeah, The Curator. The title
Yeah.
always escapes me for some weird reason. But The Curator is magnificent, and I learned things from reading it. I learned better ways to handle certain things.
Interesting. Yeah, I got to read more Owen King. The only thing I read.
Owen King is unique, and not all of his books are what you would think of as horror or anything like that. They're the earlier ones are more like I hate to use the word literary or mainstream because that's just another box, but they are double feature is really good. But I think this is his best book. He created an entire world. It's a fantasy novel, but it's got a lot of brilliance to it. And I thought, wow, how did he do that? So there were things that I was very excited about, and felt like I learned how to do some things I couldn't do before reading that book.
Wow. Well, that's cool. That's cool. So is Pandy Press also going to do other authors, or is it going to be your catalog?
Yeah, they already have. They did Dale Hallison's book, and they have, yeah, they did, and it's a good book. It's good. It's a Western. And then they did, you know, this anthology, which is by a lot of different authors, but they do have plans to do other people. I just don't know when, because they've got a lot of my backlist and they're doing quite well with that. And that's a good thing for them and me. So
Yeah.
no sweat there. So I'm not sure when they'll do that, but there's several authors they're very much interested in doing some reprints of lost books. I wish they would do my friend Neil Barrett's books, one of the most underrated, unknown, best writers out there. He was great. Neil Barrett Jr.
Well, I will certainly keep an eye on Pandy Press and Joe Lansdale titles. You got a new one coming out? I know you got Things Get Ugly.
Yeah. Well, Donut Legion, of course, is out right now. Things Get Ugly, a collection of my best crime stories. Although there are a few that aren't in there that could have been called crime stories, but I purposely left a couple out because they've been reprinted so much. And I thought if we did another volume that I would put those in there, like Night They Missed the Horror Show. I got that coming out the end of the year. I believe Subterranean has a collection coming out. And I turned in a new Happen Leonard book called Sugar on the Bones just recently. And I'm about halfway through a memoir. So.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. And I wrote a short script based on Howard Waldrop's Night of the Cooters. George Martin produced it, and Vincent D'Onofrio directed it and starred in it. It's about 30 minutes. It's been just film festivals, and it's won a couple of film festival, awards or what have you. Best in show, so it's like a dog. And I've got a couple of other things. I've got one really nice thing, but I'm not going to announce it yet. I'm going to wait. It's actually me and my daughter, but I'll wait and announce that at a later stage.
Awesome.
And so, I've always got stuff, and I got, some comic stuff coming out based on my work. So there you go.
That's so cool. I think it's amazing to talk to you and to think, you're living a charmed life. You're doing some incredible stuff, and you do it with humility. To say a movie based on your screenplay is like a dog winning Best in Show is I don't know. I think to me, the people who I love to see win are the ones that aren't setting out to win. They're just setting out.
Yeah. It's I realized the other day, I don't even know where half my awards are. I don't even know if I still have them. I don't know what happened to them. There was like 35 of them, counting Bram Stoker's and Eggers and the Spur Award and all. And I'm proud of all of them. So I don't mean to sound like I'm.
Sure.
The fact that anyone recognizes your work, you'd be an idiot not to go, oh, well, thank you. And that's important. But, that's not why I do this. And I make plenty of money. I get to do what I want. I don't have to worry about them. I own the bestseller list. None of that matters to me, and it would be nice to be. That would be another accolade. It would give my books to a wider group of people, but I may not be for a wider group of people. You don't know,
The thing is, I think your stuff works on a couple of different levels. You can read it and just enjoy what happens. but you could sit and examine and get to the why if you want.
Hope so. Yeah.
It's whatever the reader brings to the party is really going to determine how much they get out of it. But these are great stories. These are very accessible stories and very engaging and thought-provoking. And then you get something like The Bottoms, which felt like a curveball to me because that was the only one where I really didn't get any of that Lansdale humor. It was making a point, and it was going to make you look at that point until the book was done, and beautifully so. Really great stuff. And so, but there's a very human quality, and I think that's where the humor and horror come from, humanity.
Yeah. Well, you know, even in the Hap and Leonard books, even though they are, you know, series books and people think, oh, they're light. Well, they're not really. I mean, they're more that than the other, but they talk about racism. They talk about homophobia. And, you know, one character is gay and black and a Republican, and the other guy's, you know, a liberal and, you know, white. And I mean, but those are just like things you write on a slate. They don't mean anything.
Yes.
It's what you do
Amen.
with those stories and those characters. And it shouldn't be all about what's their sexuality, what's
Right.
their,
Right.
you know, political point of view. And so those are things that are just there. And when I wrote those things back in the, I guess, late 80s, early 90s, something like that, I didn't think anything about any of that. I was just trying to write about people that were interesting. You know?
Well, it works. It works every single time. And I'm going to say this. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And I'll be looking on Thursday for this release. I'll post this video. I'll do some editing. You know, we're at an hour, 17 minutes. I'll probably get it down to an hour, maybe. There's a lot of babble I put in there that I'll take out, and a lot of the ums, but I appreciate your time today. This means a lot. It means a lot to me.
Thank you a lot. Glad to do it.
Well, thank you, Joe, and good luck, and we'll be watching.
All right, bye.